All right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is our third session for our DSDN parent webinar series. We're doing them every Thursday here this spring to give you some content and information, hoping that it can be some things that will be coming up for you as you're raising your little one with Down syndrome, and that it will be content that you can come back and look on and use as a resource in the tool. Tonight, we are lucky to be joined by some of the members of the NDSC team, National Down Syndrome Congress. For those of you who were on last week when we talked about all the different organizations and acronyms and all the fun. So these ladies will be joining us tonight and discussing disability law and education and giving a nice kind of overview so you have an understanding about some of your child's rights and what this looks like for your family. And hopefully it can set a nice foundation so you can dig into this as your child ages and gets through the system. So we're really lucky to be joined by these ladies tonight. And I think that you guys will take it from here. You can see we have Ricki, Stephanie, and Jawanda joining us, and we'll have their content information and contact information here at the end as well. If you have further questions, we'll have that all going on.
Thank you. Is it my turn to start?
You are set to go, Stephanie. Thanks for joining us.
I can't hear you, but I understand that you can hear me. I'm Stephanie Smith-Lee with the National Down Syndrome Congress, and I have here with me Ricki Sabia, who is the Senior Education Policy Advisor, and Jawanda Mast, who is the Grassroots Advocacy Manager. And they will each introduce themselves a little bit when they start talking. Let's go to the next slide. We are, all of us, delighted to be here with you this evening and to share some information with you about the federal laws that have an impact on your children as they go through their education. We're going to be talking about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, a little bit about its purposes, background, and key components. And IDEA is the most important law for you to learn about. There are some other laws that it's important to have a general idea about, so we're going to be covering those a little bit, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail on IDEA and what are some of these acronyms that you hear about. You've probably been hearing about FAPE and LRE and IDEA and ESSA and ADA, and what is this alphabet soup? We're going to share with you some of the key terms and acronyms that you'll want to know about, talk about the inclusion data that's collected by the federal government, share some IDEA resources, and then Ricki is going to share background and information about the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and then a bit of a comparison about those laws and IDEA and what it means for you and your children. Jawanda is going to share a bit about the very exciting National Down Syndrome Congress convention that's coming up and talk to you about the National Down Syndrome Action Coalition, and then we'll have questions and answers. So I believe you've been told to put your questions and answers in the chat box. Next. My daughter Laura was born with Down syndrome in 1982. That was only 7 years after the first version of what's now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed. I was a young mom with my daughter unexpectedly being born with Down syndrome and a serious heart condition. And for the first couple of years, there wasn't much I could do except make sure she stayed alive until she had her second open heart surgery. Then I started getting involved in advocacy, started out as a room mother. I bet a lot of you are room mothers, and then a PTA president, and then organizing successful advocacy efforts on disability and special education issues at the local level, the state level, and then the federal level. I spent 3 years volunteering on the reauthorization of IDEA. A bill is reauthorized when Congress takes a look at it and makes some changes and re-ups it for a certain number of years. And then became the director of the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education. And we'll talk a little bit about that office and its responsibilities. And afterwards have been involved with starting up advocacy efforts at the National Down Syndrome Society initially, and now the National Down Syndrome Congress. And I focused quite a bit in the recent years on post-secondary education for students with ID. So that's a little background about me. Before 1975, there were literally millions of children and students with disabilities who were excluded from public schools entirely. In some states, there were laws that said that students with intellectual disability, although that was not the term then, but students with intellectual disability were not allowed to go to public school. And many children with disabilities who are in school did not get the services that they need. There were two Supreme Court cases that were very important that were driven by parent advocacy. And there was very strong family advocacy back in the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s that led to the passage of what was called then PL 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Now, as I said, laws every so often get looked at by Congress and reauthorized, and that's happened a number of times with what we now call IDEA. And most of those reauthorizations were positive, but unfortunately in the mid-1990s, there was a huge battle about IDEA, and a number of national organizations joined together to really try and strip IDEA of protections and allow children to be expelled and those sorts of things. And there was a 3-year battle I was involved in that ultimately ended up in a very good law that was supported by Republicans and Democrats and everybody involved. In 2004, there was another reauthorization, and that was a bit of a battle. I was involved in working in the administration at the time, working on the inside. Ricki was working very hard on the outside. And these reauthorizations are not something that we're anxious to have right now. There are folks who think, well, you know, things aren't working like they're supposed to, which is true in many cases. Children are not getting what they're entitled to under the law. The problem, though, is not the law itself. It's the way the law is administered. So we do not support having a reauthorization right now of IDEA, as some people have called for, because it could very likely result in losing rights. Next slide. So the purpose of IDEA is to ensure a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE. FAPE is a term you probably will hear a lot. And what that means is that every child with a disability has the right to special education services focused on their unique needs, not a cookie cutter, one size fits all, but their unique needs to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Now, some of the key points of this is a system of early intervention services for the infants, toddlers, and their families. There are strong due process procedural rights that ensure that students' and parents' rights are protected. There's funding that flows to the states and then is also given out in grants for things like technical assistance, personnel preparation, and so on. So those are some of the key purposes. And I said we're doing a broad overview here. Next. IDEA has 4 parts, part A, B, and C. As I said, the children with disabilities have, did we miss a slide? Can you go back one? Yeah, we missed the early intervention slide. No, go forward, go forward. This one. Okay, so part C of IDEA is early intervention. Now, what that means is that as soon as your child is born with Down syndrome, you ought to be thinking about getting your child evaluated for services. And the law requires a timely, that means it has to happen within a certain time frame, comprehensive, and that means it needs to be not just one assessment, but multi assessments evaluating different things like Now you might wonder why a baby would be evaluated for speech, but there's important oral motor things that babies need to have, occupational physical therapy and so on. And the purpose of this evaluation is to determine if the child who is referred for an evaluation by the parent or someone else is a child with who is suspected of having a disability and then is eligible for services under IDEA. And if they are found eligible, and every child with Down syndrome should be found eligible, then an individualized family service plan is developed, IFSP. That's another acronym that you'll hear about. And that IFSP is developed with the parents, and it includes services in the natural environment. It used to be, before the reauthorization in '97, that services were usually provided in centers. Now the requirement is that they be provided in a natural environment, which might be the home or a daycare center or whatever. And the services are for the babies and the toddlers and for their family. There's a good resource. We've provided the link here that explains the difference between individualized family service plans and IEPs, which I will get to in a minute. Next. So an important part of IDEA is Part B, and this is services for children who are age 3 through 21. Now, in some states like Michigan goes through 26, it's usually 21. And there's an acronym again, FAPE and the LRE. And what that means is that children have a right to an education that is free. You don't have to pay for it. It's a public education, and it is in the least restrictive environment. The word inclusion is not actually in the law. What the law talks about is least restrictive environment, or LRE. And what that means is that the child will be educated with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. The child cannot be removed from the general education class or the preschool setting unless they cannot receive a satisfactory education, even with supplementary aids and services, and modifications are allowed. Again, we have an evaluation, and it is, the first evaluation is both a full evaluation, which means you're looking at all aspects, and individual. That means it's individualized for the child. Which assessments, evaluations are used depends on the individual child. And the purpose of that is to determine if the child has a disability and the educational needs of the child. Now, every 3 years, there's a reevaluation process. That is not required to be as extensive as this first one. Once the evaluation is done, then there's an individualized education program, or IEP. And this is another important term to know. The IEP team looks at the needs and the functional abilities and academic abilities of the child, and then develops goals that include making progress in the general education curriculum. This IEP team includes the parents, so you are part of this team that makes decisions. Once the goals are determined, then placement for the child is determined, where they will be receiving the services. Next. There's some other important things to know about IDEA. One is we were talking about free, appropriate public education. There's a very important Supreme Court case called the Andrew F. Supreme Court case. And that ruling says that FAPE requires challenging academic objectives, and that IEP goals must be aligned with grade level content standards. What we see in practice too often is that children with Down syndrome are sent to separate classes and not having access to the same curriculum, same things that other children learn. And this court case was very important for dealing with that. Now, children who are preschool age are also entitled to a free public education in the least restrictive environment, or what we think of as inclusion. That can often be hard to get, though, unfortunately. This is a link from a letter from the Department of Education, Office of Special Education Program, about what is expected and required regarding inclusion for preschool age children. So I would encourage you to take a look at that letter if your children are at that age. And as I said, another key component for IDEA is the due process and procedural safeguards to protect the rights of students and parents. Next. The federal government in the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, is required to have the states collect various types of data about students with disabilities. And one piece of data that's very important to us is they're required to collect data on where children are spending their time. Unfortunately, students with intellectual disabilities, the national average for spending 80% or more of their time in the general ed classroom is only about 16%. For students who take alternate assessments, it's only about 3%. So we have a very long way to go before we achieve what we need to in terms of students being educated in the general education classrooms. This is the result of poor implementation of the law and inadequate teacher preparation. It's not a reason to amend or change IDEA at this time, as I said. Next. We have a few resources that we think will be very helpful to you. The Department of Education through OSEP has funded the TIES Center on Inclusive Practices and Policies for Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities, and we've provided that link there. TIES provides technical assistance to states and resources for educators and parents. Ricki Sabia is the one of the things she does is that she is a parent liaison for TIES, and part of her responsibilities there have been to co-author some excellent parent briefs, and there's a link here to those briefs. You also can go to the Department of Education IDEA website, which we provided here, and I've included the Rights Law website link here, and I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that website, start digging into the information that's provided there, sign up for their free newsletter. And I personally have found their book, From Emotions to Advocacy, and there's a link here, extremely helpful. I've used it personally with my kids and with family members that I've helped with their IEPs, and I would encourage you to think about getting that. Every state has at least one parent training and information center, and there are also community resource centers. And these centers are federally funded to provide information and training to parents. I would encourage you to go to this link and find the PTI, Parent Training Center, in your state and find out what kind of resources they have in training. I've given you a very brief overview of IDEA, but you can take these trainings and they really, in plain language, explain what it is you need to know to advocate for your child. I'm going to turn it over to Ricki now. Next.
Okay, I'm trying to start my video, but it's not letting me. The host has to give me permission to start the video. Well, I'm going to go ahead without the video. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, IDEA is very important and probably the most important for students with disabilities, but Every Student Succeeds Act I found to be extremely important. My son, I have a son who's 30 years old. He was born in 1992. That started my foray into education by trying to advocate for him. Here's the video. Okay, by trying to advocate for him, I got involved in the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education, which led me to get involved in state and district and then federal work. I also worked for 20 years in the federal field doing advocacy on education, particularly K-12 education laws. I am a lawyer, so I've actually written some of the language that has appeared in IDA and also in this law ESSA, as well as in the regulations. And regulations are what are put out by the Department of Education to help states implement the law. It kind of dives in a little deeper on some of the things that are in the law. So that's what the word regulations mean. I've also worked on a lot of federally funded projects, including the TIES Center project, as Stephanie just told you about. So the Every Student Succeeds Act is a law that applies to all students in elementary and secondary education. And it was enacted in 1965. It was primarily a civil rights law. It was for all kids in elementary, secondary education, but focusing particularly on economically disadvantaged students, students of racial minorities. At that time, students with disabilities, as Stephanie said, weren't even in school. So it didn't really contemplate them. But as time went on and students with disabilities came into the schools, they were included in this law. And then a big change came in 2002 with the NCLB, which was the No Child Left Behind Act. And, you know, there were a lot of people that didn't like it for a lot of reasons, but it did some very important things. And the most important thing it did was to say that we are holding schools accountable because we're giving them all this money. We're going to hold states and districts and schools accountable for educating these students. And prior to No Child Left Behind, they looked at schools on the average. And of course, if you had, like in my district, they would put the kids with disabilities in the school with the gifted programs and then average it out. And so the school would look good, even though the kids with disabilities were doing poorly. So what No Child Left Behind said is, no, we're going to disaggregate. The word disaggregate means separately collect data on certain subgroups. And if those subgroups are not doing well, then the school is considered as needing improvement. It's not enough that on average, the school does well. So one of those subgroups is students with disabilities, as well as economically disadvantaged students, students from racial and ethnic backgrounds, and English learners. And in 2015, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was reauthorized or amended again, and it was called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act this time. But it's all really the same law, just being amended as time goes on. So very important part about that law is the accountability. You get funding, you have to be held accountable for making sure that kids are doing academically as they should. And we're not just going to look at the whole school, we're going to look at each of these subgroups, and that's going to make a difference in how you're held accountable. So for the first time, we could actually see what students with disabilities were doing in terms of their academic progress, which you couldn't really tell before. IDA did not have a data collection aspect in terms of how well these kids were doing with the services that they received. And the purpose of ESSA is to provide all children with significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high quality education and to close educational achievement gaps. Now, if you compare that to a free appropriate meaning some academic benefit, that arguably raises the bar for what's appropriate, because this includes all students, including students with disabilities. So fair, equitable, and high quality sounds a lot better than appropriate. Next slide, please. So some of these components that are in ESSA is that in order to be held accountable, states and districts must submit an implementation plan, and they're supposed to get public input from stakeholders like parents and others. The schools are held accountable, like I said, for all students, but also each student subgroup. And if a certain student subgroup is not doing well, they can get targeted support and improvement. Comprehensive support and improvement is for if the whole school's not doing well, but targeted support and improvement can happen if just one subgroup, like the disability subgroup, is not up to par. And in order to hold the schools accountable, they require an annual state assessment in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. And I know there's a lot of pushback sometimes about assessments, and the problem is that there are a lot of state and local assessments too. So really, the federal government only requires one assessment a year, but a lot of these other assessments are local and state. Also, you know, there are a lot of parents who don't like their child taking the assessment, But the problem is, if you don't have students with disabilities taking these assessments, like in the old days, they used to send them, on a field trip. And now under ESSA, they're supposed to have 95% or more of students with disabilities being assessed. And really under IDA, it's supposed to be every student who is being assessed. If that doesn't happen, then we get skewed data and the school may not get the support it needs to improve. So, you have to really think about whether or not you want to opt your kid out of assessments, because it does have a more global impact. And also, ESSA provides important provisions for students who take alternate assessments. And many students with Down syndrome take alternate assessments, if not in elementary school, then later on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what happened is some of the language in past laws did not really support students who took alternate assessments. So in 2015, working for NDSC, I was able to get a fair amount of changes in the language to support students who take alternate assessments and make sure that they get progress in the grade level content standards. They may be modified, like Stephanie said, modifications do not keep you from being included in regular classes. You can get adapted materials, all of the rest, but you should still be getting content that's aligned to the same content that other students are getting. And we also got in the language that the student should have a right to complete the requirements of a regular high school diploma, to attempt to complete it. No student is guaranteed a diploma, but before 2015, students who took an alternate assessment were automatically excluded from even trying to get a regular diploma. And even if your child doesn't ultimately get a diploma, staying on diploma track as long as they can is going to get them a better education. And I had to really fight to do that for my son, because we didn't have this language at the time in the Every Student Succeeds Act, and now we do. So this link is to the language that is in this 2015 reauthorization and gives you some tips on how to take this language and how to use it in your IEP. Next slide, please. So the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, yes. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and what we all think of is, curb cuts and ramps to get into buildings. And, to a large extent, it really is a law about access, physical access, but also other kinds of access. And it was enacted in 1990, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, public services, and accommodations. And part of public services are schools. And in education, the ADA, especially Title II of IDA, provides for non-discrimination and reasonable accommodations. So it doesn't provide all the things that IDA does, but it does say that schools need to provide some reasonable accommodations to students. And this is including private schools, whether or not they get federal funds, but it does not apply to religious schools. And accommodations are not required if a particular aid or service would result in a fundamental alteration of the services or would impose an undue burden. So, there are limits to the accommodations that you can get under ADA. And part of what we're going to be helping you understand by talking about some of these other laws is how important IDA is. And although these other laws are helpful, they are not as good for our children to get a quality education as IDEA and ESSA actually are. So an ADA Title II, when combined with Section 504, which we'll be talking about in a minute, can give some additional protection, but still without IDA, it's more about access than it is about progress and educational benefit. And that's why IDA is superior. Next slide, please. So ADA key provisions. So there are some tax credits to remove barriers to, and for there not to, like I said, for the, there to be ramps or other things like that. But there is no funding to states like IDA has. IDA actually provides funding to all the states to help pay for. Now, they don't pay for enough of it, and that's why we're advocating for full funding bills. But they do provide funding, unlike ADA, for the education of students with disabilities. There are some complaint procedures for noncompliance for ADA, but there isn't the individual due process or procedural safeguards that Stephanie talked about for students with disabilities and their families. And these are some examples of reasonable accommodations you might be able to get under the ADA. As you can see by looking at them, these are also things you can get in your IEP under supplementary aids and services. And as Stephanie said earlier, the LRE provisions say, that you don't take the child out of the classroom unless they can't be satisfactorily educated, even with supplementary aids and services. Next slide, please. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is another law that applies to students with disabilities. Now, this one only applies to institutions receiving federal funds. So it doesn't apply to as many private schools as ADA does, because a lot of private schools don't get any federal funds, although there might be some that have special programs like technology grants or different things. If they get any kind of money like that, then Section 504 applies. It has broader, there are more types of disabilities that might fit under Section 504. As Stephanie said, students with Down syndrome definitely fit under IDA. There are other students who may have much more minor disabilities who may not be eligible under IDA, and then they get a 504 plan. But it mostly is about accommodations, some of the things we just talked about, eliminating barriers that exclude the students from participating in protected activities. It does include a free, appropriate public education, but provides far less rights and protections than IDA does. Next slide, please. So as I said, there's a broader definition of disability, but protections of non-discrimination apply even without a 504 plan. So under IDA, you have the same protections. 504 still applies to you, plus you have the protections of IDA. But if you have a 504 plan, you don't have the protections under IDA. It doesn't work both ways. 504 does have some FAPE language for each qualified student with a disability, provision of regular or special education, related aids and services, but a more limited variety than under IDA. It does not provide funding for services, again, just like ADA, so it's not funded. And there's no requirement for academic improvement. And there's also no requirement for parental involvement. It talks about knowledgeable people, but it doesn't actually require parental involvement. So these are all the ways in which IDA is different. 504 doesn't provide those things. It does provide a right to a due process hearing, unlike ADA, but if the parent wishes to contest certain actions, but mostly these rules about due process are left to the district. So there aren't a strong federal language and protections in terms of due process that IDA has. Next slide. So now we're just going to do a brief comparison to ADA and 504. So all the ADA and 504 apply to our kids with IEPs, but it doesn't work the other way around, like I said. So IDA has greater protections for parents and students regarding due process, participation in developing those IFSPs for the little ones, the IEPs for 3 to 21 plus, protection for discipline, if a child is acting out, there's more protection in terms of them not getting kicked out for disciplinary problems. As I said, 504 refers to knowledgeable parties, not necessarily parents. IDA provides funding to pay for services, unlike the other law. IDA has strong LRE language, which Stephanie talked about, even though it has poor implementation. Interestingly, a lot of people assume that if you have a 504 plan and don't have an IEP, then you're guaranteed that your child will be in the general education classroom. But in actual fact, Section 504 has the same exact LRE language as IDEA. The fact that more kids with 504 plans are included is more a matter of practice, and likely because the students who have 504 plans, at least up to now, instead of IEPs, have much milder disabilities that only require some accommodations. So there's not as much pressure, to put them in separate classes. If all of a sudden a whole bunch of students with more significant disabilities start saying, we only want 504 plans, include our kids, I would almost bet that we would start seeing 504 classes popping up, just like we see in many places, separate classes for English learners who don't even have any disabilities. IDA's focus is more on academic benefit and access, but also progress in the general education curriculum, not simple access or non-discrimination. And as I've said a number of times, students under IDA get IDA and 504 protections, but a student with a 504 plan does not get the IDA protections. Next slide. So there is some confusion online on social media. We see a lot of people sometimes talking about this idea of revoking IDEA, by which they mean if you refuse IDA special education services and refuse an IEP for your child, then therefore your child will get similar rights and benefits, and the school would have to place them in a general education classroom. And as I just explained, that's not a given. And especially if the schools start seeing a whole bunch of kids with more significant disabilities getting 504 plans, I bet that would change pretty quickly. And there certainly are not the same services and rights if you have a 504 plan and do not have an IEP. And this is a quote, which I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, from Rights Law. That's the organization that puts out all this great material that Stephanie gave you the website. And they wanted to make it clear that even though some parents think that a child is going to be placed in a special ed class if they have an IEP, but if the child has a 504 plan, they will be in the regular classroom, that they think it's more desirable to have a 504 plan, but that's not correct. And that you can get inclusion in a regular education classroom by advocating under IDEA. And there's a lot of work going on, like at the TIE Center, and we have a new OSEP director who's been putting a focus on the fact that kids who are in certain disability categories, like intellectual disabilities, are not included as much as some of the other categories. So, we're working towards movement on that. But if you have a 504 plan, the child will have fewer rights than the child who receives special education services. And that's a very important point, to remember. Every family has to make their decisions, but they need to make it with the right information. Next slide, please. And here we have some different resources where they're comparing the rights and benefits in greater detail of the different laws. And hopefully you will look at that. If you have any additional questions and want to dive deeper, you can use these resources to do that. Next slide. So now I will be handing it over to the wonderful Jawanda Mast.
The host has stopped my video too, but Jim will let me see you all soon. I'm really excited to be with you all tonight. I was actually at DSDN's Rockin' Moms retreat about 5 years ago, and it was a really good time. My daughter, Rachel, was born almost 23 years ago with Down syndrome. We lived in the Memphis area at the time, and I immediately became involved in building a Down syndrome group and doing new parent outreach and policy advocacy. And I do not remember when I met Stephanie and Ricki, but I can tell you that I feel like I have always known them and always looked to them for guidance in advocating for my own daughter to be included in the public school system, and also to help other families. And since my family moved to Kansas, my delightful Southern accent is not from Kansas, but I live in Kansas, and my daughter did graduate with a regular diploma from our high school here. And that was largely in part because I knew the law and could advocate for my daughter. And one of the things that I would love to tell all of you is I learned about the law through my early intervention program when Rachel was in early intervention, and it was a component of our training that all of our families take these classes they offered on special education law. And that really was my backbone. My daughter and I have gone on to work on lots of legislation, probably most well known for helping to pass the Federal ABLE Act. And that's kind of how I got in the grassroots advocacy business. So I am the grassroots advocacy manager for the National Down Syndrome Congress. And I want to tell you about a couple of opportunities we have. And one reason these opportunities are important for you guys is because it will help you to be able to have access to education about important policy issues, but it will also allow you to connect with other families and seek information that may help clarify issues you have come up, and education in other areas. There's lots of different areas that we deal with our individuals with Down syndrome. And we just want to provide you with some of the resources that might be helpful to you. So the first thing I'm going to tell you about is our National Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition. It's called NDAC. I cannot see my whole slide, Jen, but you can go online to register for NDAC. Just go to the National Down Syndrome Congress and go under Policy and Advocacy, and you'll see about NDAC. NDAC is our grassroots advocacy program, and we educate individuals with Down syndrome, family members, and other allies on policy issues. It's free to join. We have an online application, and we have an active closed Facebook group. We also do quarterly update webinars. We provide a lot of information via Facebook and those webinars to help families. And this also allows us to be able to organize and bring people together quickly. Like, let's say Jen is in Iowa, and let's say we had something going on in Iowa that we needed to have advocates from there help us with. If you're a member of NDAC, it automatically gives us a way to reach you and get that information to you, and you get it to other people. So we would love to have you join NDAC. And as I said, it is free, and there's an online application. Next slide, Jen. We have 537 NDAC members across the country, and we have group members. I'm not going to go into that. You can read about that online, but your organizations can join as group members and also have access to some different things that you can share with other families in your local organizations through some of your DSDN activities, I believe, too. Next slide. Well, here's the application stuff. I should have paid more attention to the slides. So this tells you how to do the application. Again, it's a very easy application to do. After you do that application, you will be contacted, and we will give you information about the Facebook group so that you can join that. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. Our contact information is at the end of this presentation, and we'll be happy to help you with that. Next slide, please. Some of the ways that we help families know what's going on in advocacy are through our NDSC Policy communications. As I mentioned, we have a Facebook group. We also have a Facebook page for policy and advocacy. Where the Facebook group for NDAC members is closed and private, our policy page is open. So where we post a lot of information, articles, things that are going on around the country. Our NDAC group, we may post those same things, but we will also post things. That's where we are going to be more likely to post things that may ask you to reach out to your legislators. Just tonight, we have one posted asking families in Louisiana to reach out to their legislators in support of funding for post-secondary education programs. So that's the kind of stuff you would get. We also have action alerts. You sign up for action alerts, and what those are is when there is an issue often on the federal level that we need help with, we will send that action alert out, and it will walk you through step by step what you need to do to reach out to your federal legislator and make your voice known. So it's a really good way to educate yourself, but also to have a really easy mechanism for being able to reach out and impact change. Next slide. Two things I want to tell you about on this slide. I hope you all have heard of the National Down Syndrome Congress Convention. This is the 50th annual convention, and it is June 23rd through 26th in New Orleans. And you can go online to ndsccenter.org, and there's a whole section on the convention. The convention brings together several thousand people from across the country of all ages, self-advocates. There's a special track for youth and adults, which are self-advocates that are 15 and older. And the conference allows you to really hear from experts from around the world on all kinds of things: education, speech, behavior, medical research. We have a number of advocacy related workshops that we do. I'm going to tell you about one specifically in just a minute. But one of the things, especially when I was when my daughter was younger and I would go to the convention, that I loved was the access to the experts. You go to these workshops with the people who've written these books, and then you actually usually have access to them to be able to ask questions. But it's a great opportunity to network with other families and learn. One of the things we started 5 years ago was the NDSC Advocacy Training Boot Camp. We have so many people that want to know how to do policy advocacy. It's kind of scary, and people feel like they need some training. So we started a boot camp aimed at beginners. It has been very, very popular. We've had several hundred people the last 2 years at the online option. We don't have the online option this year, but it is on Sunday, June 26th, the last day of convention, from 8:30 to noon. It is included with your registration for convention. And it really does aim at beginning advocates. And this year we are focused on local and state advocacy. We pass policy on the federal level, but often these policies are implemented and largely funded on the local and state level. So it's important to make those connections. Two things I'm really excited about for our advocacy training bootcamp this year. We have 2 state legislators from the state of Louisiana who will be with us. One of our, we'll have 2 different self-advocates that are going to interview them, and they're going to share tips for how to establish relationships and work with your legislators. And then we're collaborating with them Proveneers. If you don't know about them, look them up. They're wonderful. It's a improv acting troupe out of Ohio, and they offer classes all over the country. But we're going to be having skits mostly with our self-advocates for model and not so model meetings, so that you'll kind of know what goes on in those meetings. We have a lot of other things going on at the boot camp, and you can find more information about that on the website too. Next slide. One of the things we're very excited about is that OSEP, which is the Office of Special Education Programs out of Washington, D.C., is going to have a large presence at the NDSC convention this year. It's really unusual to have this much access to OSEP. We have never had as much access as we're going to have this year. Valerie C. Williams is the director of the Office of Special Education Programs, and she's a former vice president of NDSC board and the parent of a child with Down syndrome. She is going to be there, and we're going to be having listening sessions broken out by age groups from early intervention, school age, and then high school and transition, where we will have OSEP senior officials there, and some questions will be facilitated to address concerns. We're also going to be having a town hall meeting. Ms. Williams is going to be making comments at one of the plenary sessions. So it will be an wonderful time to learn more about what OSEP does and why you should care about OSEP. And it will be it will be unprecedented access and something that we will not have the opportunity to do every year. So I encourage you to watch for information on that, and reach out and ask questions if you want more information on that too. Next slide. This is our contact information. You can reach any of us by email at these email addresses. And if you have any questions, I know some of you will be watching or not going to be live with us, will be listening to this and seeing the slides at a later time. Please feel free to reach out to us and we will do our best to help you or give you direction. And Jen, I think that wraps us up if Stephanie and Ricki don't have anything else. And I haven't seen a single question.
I was just double checking the chat to be sure that there wasn't anything that was popped up, but I know at least a few of the parents' names that I notice on here have some pretty young ones, and I think at least one of them are an expecting family. So they are probably just soaking in all of the information tonight is my guess. So gosh, I just want to hit on a couple of things that are, I think, so key. Obviously, you can tell just by listening to Jawanda and Stephanie and Ricki, the vast experience that they have in all of this. They've lived it. They've been on both sides of policymaking, of living it with their own children, potentially. It's just been just such a wealth of knowledge. As Owen, so I don't know if we discussed this at the last webinar, but Owen is 9. And so, we're into all the thick of this. We actually just went through due process the last school year with him. So it's just, you can never hear this information enough, I feel like. So the more that we can lay this foundation out for everybody, I think is just wonderful. I would say to all the parents who are listening and people who are, watching some of this as we go, overwhelming is probably a word that you're feeling right now, and that's okay. It is overwhelming, but you'll follow your child along as they're going through this process, and alongside of them, you'll keep up ahead so kind of what's coming down the pike too. But you're not going to have to deal with all of this tomorrow, likely. So thinking about it, digging into resources. I just wanted to highlight, I know we've talked about these on one of the last webinars too, Rights Law. I just cannot say enough about that website and those book resources. I know we talked about them last week too, but they just really are great resources for parent advocates, especially just to be able to look at it and dig into pieces as you're seeing fit. The website's a little overwhelming also, and a lot of things on there, but I found it more easy for our family to get the books and do some highlighting and reading that way. Also, we talked about all of this disability and law pieces, having an advocate alongside of you. If you're really feeling uncomfortable with some of this or stressing about it or having anxiety, look at local advocates that you might bring into these conversations, especially as you start into some of the school age pieces with your kids. I also recommend even just taking a critical friend with you. It doesn't even have to be somebody who has deep knowledge in each of these things, but somebody who can be a listening ear there with you and remind you of what you heard and talked about with your teams, and how that applies and what pieces you might need to dig into as well. And there was another website, I think it's COPA, that's I would have to look up the acronym. Somebody smarter than me will find it here in a minute, I'm sure.
It's the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates.
Thank you, Ricki. Oh, like a voice from above. Perfect.
Was that in your list of resources, Ricki?
No, it wasn't
Okay.
there. It's copaa.org.
Yep. We'll throw it in the chat here too, and we can put it on the list. But that was actually how we found our advocate here locally. And she happened to be an advocate/attorney. And so that worked out really nicely for us when we moved into due process transition. But that's another resource to look for somebody locally if you're trying to find that resource. Some school districts or education agencies also offer those services, but you just need to kind of figure out what's best for your family that way. Just so much information here tonight. I will see if anybody has any other questions here before we pop off.
Jen, I'm going to piggyback just real quick on what you said about taking someone with you. I took I'm pretty vocal and can speak up for myself and my child, but we did not take an advocate. We felt like we learned the law and have the resources, and that served us. But we did always take an extra person with us to have those extra ears, to listen and to help us process, because IEP meetings and all this are very emotional for us as parents. And I think that was a really good suggestion that you had. To sometimes you just need that other person to be there with you to give you the moral support you need, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And welcome. You know, I think it just makes for me as a parent, I mean, gosh, I've got 2 degrees in education. I could be a special ed supervisor for a district if I wanted to be, and still felt stressed during all of those meetings. And just, you're kid's best advocate, and it just brings a whole nother layer, even when you have all the information. So it definitely just pieces to think about and consider for your family as you're going through all of the pieces.
And I think it's important to remember that all of us here were where you were, and we weren't always professionally doing this. I mean, I was a stay-at-home mom, I just learned this along the way. Now, that's not to say you're going to go do all this, but it came, little by little by little by little. But we were all that mom, with the baby, not knowing the law, not knowing any of it, and learning it as we went along.
Absolutely. Well, I love that so much. A couple other questions that came up. Will you get the slides? Yes, I think that we said we could get these slides posted, so we'll get those all up for everybody. And then, like I said, the recordings will be available next month. I left this slide up just so you could see the ladies' emails if you need them at all. I know that they would be happy to talk with you or get you pointed to the right resources if they're not the person for you at the time. I just appreciate all of your time here tonight, ladies. NDSC, thank you, Rockstar Moms. It just warms my heart. I know all of the things that we're able to do with our kids are because of the things that you have all done for your kids over the years, and so many other parents before you and alongside of you. So thank you. In case you don't hear it enough, we appreciate it, especially with our younger little people, and just having that sense of what to look forward to and think about, and just that foresight, I think, is huge for all of us, and learning from what you went through. So thank you a million for coming on tonight and joining us. Stephanie, I can see you saying you're welcome. Thank you. We can't quite hear your sweet little voice again, but
thank you I'm sure she's saying thank you for the opportunity.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'll right back to sign.
Yeah.
And if there's anything else that pops up, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here. But if anybody has any other further questions, we could certainly take a few questions. I know we're getting on to our time a little bit here. And it looks like, yeah, I don't think there's any other questions popping up. So awesome, awesome. Anything else, ladies, for the good of the group? Excellent. Well, that will end our session here tonight. Remember, next week is a big one. Oh, I should have left my screen share up for that. Oh my gosh, I've got to put it back up. Many apologies if you can see my incredibly messy desktop right now. I'm so embarrassed by how my desktop looks. But next week's session is a big one. I know for a lot of us, and I'm sure anybody who's watching right now knows, we have session 4 with Dr. Stein, who wrote the Positive Behavior Supports book. And for those of us who especially have young ones, this book was like a life changer for my life. So I hope it will be just as helpful to all of you as you get in and listen a little bit and hear just about some general strategies that typically work with our kiddos and things to think about as we help support their behavior and support our sanity at the same time. So there we go. Excellent. Well, I am going to pop off here tonight. Please let us know what questions anybody's having. We have everything coming up here in the next few weeks. 2 more sessions, like I said, next week with Dr. Stein, and then the beginning of May, we'll have some team members on from NDSS, so that's National Down Syndrome Society, talking about the differences between the IFSPs and the IEPs, which is kind of part of what we talked about tonight, and getting more in depth into that because those start before you know it with your little ones. So thanks so much for joining us tonight, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your week and hope to see you next week as well.